Cyber Minutes podcast is for educational purposes only. The views expressed by hosts and guests are their own, not necessarily their employers. Advice discussed is general advice. We promote ethical discussions, not illegal activities. Listen responsibly. Well, welcome back to the Cyber Minutes podcast. We have Flynn, and myself, Max, as always. So let's start this off with a little bit of a chat around some recent events, such as the 23andMe breach that's just happened this week. I'll let Flynn start us off.
So we all know that data breaches aren't good, but I think that this one really highlights how some data breaches can be scary, and this data breach can potentially be really scary, 20 to 30 years down the line, just because of the data that was breached, which was basically genetic information. So you could find the race of people online, which is obviously very scary. The world's not a perfect place. There's a lot of people that have their prejudices. Yeah. And to think that, 20 years down the line, some random guy who may be anti-Semitic could just pick up a piece of information about someone and target someone based off that is very scary. And the fact that that data wasn't taken seriously is also very scary.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the scary, even more scary thing, if we're saying scary so many times, is also that you're not just losing your passwords or your, and those things you can change. This is something you can't change. You can't change your ancestry. You can't change your history. And we don't know if the malicious actor is telling the truth or not, but he said at 23andMe, the company, their data was very easy to break into. And he said, in his words, that the data is safer in his hands than it is in 23andMe's hands, whatever that could possibly mean. But no, losing your ancestry data online is no joke. And like Flynn said, in 20 years, you don't want people knowing your ancestry and maybe holding that against you in whatever the world will be then.
Yeah, it could potentially hold you back in a professional sense. It could hold you back, and it's just a scary thing to have. It's always going to, psychologically damage people in the future.
Yes, a real serious one that you're losing.
Do we know of any of the more severe effects that it could have right now beyond these sort of
Well, I mean, if you're talking in the current geopolitical environment, certain, I won't say who, but certain ethnic groups are being persecuted based on ancestry. So if there were people that are revealing or losing their ancestral data online, then, it makes it easy to pick and choose people.
Yeah, there's definitely a big avenue for using this data to be prejudiced and discriminatory, but guess I'm wondering, what other thing do we know? Is there?
I think another scary thought is that obviously this guy could probably get bribed.
Yeah.
And that information is probably going to be valuable to a government entity, and a lot of them have unlimited resources.
Yeah.
So what if, a big malicious actor buys it and then, they just keep it on the wraps for a while? I think this also goes back to what we've said previously, where does certain information need to be online?
No.
You want to find out that you're 10% French, is it really worth it?
No. Yeah. And is it worth knowing that you're related to, Mickey McGee?
Yeah.
When, what if Mickey McGee did war crimes, right? And then then suddenly you're in the shit because, everyone knows you're related to him.
Yeah.
So I think, answering Flynn's question a little bit, I don't actually think we are going to be able to fully understand the effects of this.
That's so.
But I think that even just the residual psychological damage of the victims, even if nothing ever happened to it, you've got that in the back of your mind of someone could do it.
Track my family history. Yeah.
And you have no power over it.
No, exactly. On a slightly lighter note, let's move on to the disconnect between governance and technical cybersecurity professionals. Yeah, so we were having a chat about this a little bit before offline. We were calling it a bottleneck, which I don't think it's called a bottleneck, but I think it's like a multiplicative sort of factor where if your governance and technical people are both there, get along, communicate well, it greatly uplifts the business. And then if you are really poor in one or the other, then that actually really, really drags your business down a lot in terms of not only technical, but also
managerial,
every.
So something I've often seen in a lot of the companies I've worked for is that they typically, a lot of the times, they're butting heads, they're neck and neck with each other, which just doesn't really work. I kind of get it because, being a more governance-focused person myself, I'm sure a lot of people don't like being told what to do. So it's, especially if it's coming from someone where you think like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. I think there's a lot of egos involved and, emotions, but at the end of the day, you need both. An example I used with someone recently, it was a more technical person who was brilliant technically, but didn't really understand the importance of governance. And they kind of said, well, a lot of this is just fluff that we're just using to get past the line with regulation, which sometimes may be the case. We made the example to them that, hey, if you had a cyber incident right now, who would you notify? And they basically said, oh, we would notify the stakeholders. And they're like, oh, would you know what regulatory bodies, blah, blah. Like, obviously, we came to the conclusion of you would need to go straight to the AFP. But they couldn't tell us that. And that's the case in a lot of industries or companies, where, they had these things in place. And it's a similar thing of, if Max from Max Industries, he knows everything. So if something happened, he could handle it. But, what if Max got hit by a bus tomorrow? What if they had to bring someone else in? You need the documentation in place so that person can then understand what's going on. If you don't have that, you got a major risk where if somebody decides to quit, something happens to that person.
I'm going to make sure I look both ways before crossing the street tomorrow, just in case.
So Max Industries is in trouble.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that if you, even if you had at least a non-technical cyber professional in that company you're talking about, they would at least be able to know from the crisis management, from the managerial governance point of view, that they need to, which authorities they need to.
So to put into context, this company was a small technical-based company, like 3 to 4 employees. So they're really only just starting to realize these things because even though they're a small company, they look after a lot of stuff. And people have been asking, like, hey, you need to have these things in place. And, a lot of people get caught up with, they're busy and stuff like that. And obviously doing this stuff doesn't have the clear, direct profit margins because, it's pre-incident.
So in that case as well, like I was saying with the multiplicative sort of index, is having just one person who's a more governance-focused individual or professional, they're going to, drastically improve their...
But I think a big part of it is just being open-minded to both sides. And also looking for advice when you need it. If you don't know how to do something, just look for that advice. Or get somebody in. Obviously, that can be expensive sometimes, but
I was looking at the other side of this argument, more the all governance, no technical side of it, and there's issues there as well. This company that I was looking at had a pretty great awareness of their need for cybersecurity and management strategies and all that stuff, and they knew they needed a bit of technical side. But the issue is that they had to outsource it, and they outsourced it to one company, who outsourced it to another company, and to another company. So then you had this whole trust chain where this original small company was having their cybersecurity managed so far with such a long chain that they really had no clue what was going on. They were getting some reports from the security provider, and these reports were just nonsense. They're all fluff. It was all this big zero of no incidents. And there was actually one incident on this report, but they didn't tell you really what that was in simple terms. The governance people knew they needed a technical side, and they did their best to get that technical in place, but unfortunately they had to outsource it.
It's not easy sometimes where resourcing comes involved as well. I assume that just the way you described it sounds like a bit of an older industry. This sounds like a bit of they know the governance stuff because they've been around for so long, but they just need to have that technical aspect.
I think that also creates a bit of a Tetris kind of game. What that makes a Tetris tower almost. If you're outsourcing everything and you're outsourcing every little technical aspect of it, you're not only creating lots of fluff and kind of weird communication chain, but you're also spreading your risk.
Exactly.
And it only takes one of the important Tetris blocks to come out before all of your everything comes battling down.
Funnily enough, when you say when you described they're getting everything outsourced technically, I think a solution to that sometimes can be more governance, because then they write but I assume the problem is that nobody understands technical control.
There's just no technical understanding within the company. They understand that they need it, but they just have no idea how to implement it. Like there was a I wouldn't call it a typo, but it was just at one point in one of the things I was reading, it said, we don't do any of our own programming, which was just sort of a dog whistle that they just have never even looked at a piece of code before or looked at like anything technical. And, that's fine, but it's a difficult thing to manage. It's sort of a conundrum.
It's easy to say these things that you need to have both, but when you get those smaller companies, you get those people that understand both, they're a bit of a gold mine. Because they understand the importance of both and they can understand it to a degree. Which there are people that can do that.
But
what stops them from going to another company that's going to pay them more, right?
Exactly.
I think it's this whole thing of a lot of the world doesn't have enough tech literacy, and I think that's one thing that will change, but I think it's some of the older generations are...
I don't know if it will change, because we say tech literacy, but by the time we get into the future, it's going to be harder.
You're right. There's very few people interacting with any command line or anything like that these days.
And it's going to be more simple. Like, it was still pretty easy when we were kids, but, we still had to do a little bit of know-how when stuff was...
I think there's a real... I was talking about this before, actually. I had a good question when presenting something. It was about growing up in a technical landscape. And I think that something that a lot of people forget is that maybe for our sort of age demographic, we had to figure out and kind of understand a lot of the technology very young. So for me, I'm someone who always gets problems on the computer. I would be the first person in the existence of humanity to have that kind of issue. So it would mean that I'd have to spend, an hour and a half Googling, understanding what the problem is, what's the nature of the error, what's causing it, and then really dig a lot to try and find the problem. And I think as technology is getting better and less clunky, that skill may actually be a bit harder to find.
Yeah.
In the same sense, if you grew up before the time where technology was janky, it's also something that you probably don't spend a lot of time.
Yeah, there's those fair few people that they're absolute whizzes with it, but then the majority of people don't have a clue about it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But no, I think that's a pretty good sort of skill that I think probably a few of us have developed.
Yeah, we just need to teach kids to break stuff again.
Yeah, as tech becomes more succinct, and more easy to use and less buggy, that skill kind of goes out the window a little bit.
Yeah. Good times make bad hackers. Bad tests make good hackers.
All right, well, let's move on to our next topic. So in the last month or so, if you've been paying any attention in the cyber world news, there's been a good 3 or 4 0 days or CVSS 10 vulnerabilities going around. One of the biggest ones that we've kind of seen and noticed and that's creating a big impact is this Cisco iOS XE vulnerability, which is allowing users to get remote admin access on...
Yeah, I think even on top of the admin, I think it was level 15, which is the highest.
Control, you get control of the whole network type of thing. Yeah, so worrying.
We see it all the time. It's kind of inevitable that the big companies have it. We saw Log4j was the last one, which was kind of everyone was, oh my God, this is crazy.
Yeah. And we're seeing a lot more of these in higher frequency than ever before, really.
How would you say that you work around these things? Can you? Sometimes it's can you really do much?
Well, I mean, there are, luckily in most sort of medium to big size companies with a fairly sizable cyber team, there are people who it's their entire life and job to do vulnerability remediation. So we have those people at my company, and they're usually a bit stressed, and they're usually always a bit
burnt
out, maybe a little bit, but they're more pessimistic is the word I'm thinking of. They're a bit more doom and gloom sort of, because it just keeps getting worse and worse. Yeah, what you have to do to make sure that you're kind of addressing these vulnerabilities as quick as possible is having that team in place, those people that are ready to get those boots on ground. And it's also really essential that you have quick remediation times, so they're quick. That's something that a lot of companies kind of struggle with. Bigger companies, as I'm sure we probably have some understanding of, the bigger the company, the more rigid it is, the harder it is to move things through it quickly.
Yeah.
So being able to have that kind of agile nature in your company and having a quick change request timeline is really important, because a lot of the times if you're waiting for change requests for 3 weeks before things get put in, big vulnerability comes around the door. You need to be able to adapt to that and fix it quickly. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, something it's not exactly related, but it kind of is I've been running a lot of BIA workshops recently where we kind of identify the critical business functions. And one thing that we're always looking at is what's the time period you need to have this function back up at.
Yeah.
And something that we see is a bit of disconnect even within a company to its other departments is they'll say, we need this up within 2 hours. And it's like, okay, well, the technology can only get it up in 4 hours. So I think that it's a bit of an understanding between departments and having those, it's almost like an SLA, but it's not an SLA because it's within your own company.
Yeah.
But those time frames as the recovery point objectives, the maximum tolerable period of disruption.
Yeah.
Having those in place and sticking by them, testing them, don't just come up with an arbitrary number, actually go and test it.
Yeah, you've got to, it really relies all on what's your responsiveness like. So we have sort of metrics that show up at work that kind of show our responsiveness levels, and it can be an arbitrary number sometimes, like something useless, but generally the software we use kind of translates that into time and bringing that down as much as you can. So as soon as vulnerabilities are arising, developing strategies to fix things quickly, even if it's critical business systems, getting them back up and running, patching, making sure those things are agile as possible is a real big part of making sure to combat these vulnerabilities. And I mean, it becomes harder with the Cisco one because they haven't even really released a patch.
Yeah.
So I guess that's not
turn off everything.
I think that is just unplug it. Unplug everything.
But I think that it's kind of unavoidable with situations like Cisco where it's your entire infrastructure. But if you can not have so heavy a reliance on one particular thing, I would say avoid it.
Yeah.
Or if you do have the contingency in place, like a common one is, if you can't deal with Cisco because it's your infrastructure, but say one application's not working, move to another competitor, for example. Sometimes that's unavoidable.
Other key ones to mention from this month, besides from Cisco, are Atlassian. If you're using an Atlassian server or a Confluence server or some other Confluence system, then users are able to create admin accounts remotely, and that's control over your Confluence server. So that's a rough one, as well as the libwebp library. So this is another classic vulnerable library attack. Log4j was the last case of a big library that was vulnerable, but
this are aware of anyway.
That we're aware of. libwebp also got a 10 score in the CVSS rating, so that's as bad as it gets. So make sure that you're not using that.
Do you know what that one did?
So what the actual error is it's a remote users that are interacting with your systems. They can actually invoke a buffer overflow error and then run code outside of the normal environment. So that's a pretty bad one.
Just by the way, for our listeners, we are recording this in advance. So if you have any of these vulnerabilities, just have another look because the Cisco update is hopefully out by now.
Hopefully out by now, by the time this goes live.
Yeah.
There hasn't been a new one.
Yeah. Oh, who knows? Maybe it's turmoil.
Maybe. Who knows? Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, another thing to bring up is if you're at CyberCon this week or last week, whenever this goes live, hope you're having fun. Looks like it's a good one, good amount of people. There's probably, this would be a good time to do a cyber attack on a Australian company because
do you got a skeleton crew?
Skeleton crew, yeah. A lot of places are running skeleton crews. Well,
we're coming up on Christmas, really. That's going to be, that could be a big thing.
Really, hopefully no more Log4js Christmas time. That's a rough one.
You're going to get back to work and hate your life.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I guess as well, another thing to bring up is I went to the Women in Security Awards last week. So that was fantastic, really good. So props to the organisers. Fantastic night, great food, really good shows and everything. And congrats to all the award winners. That's another big one. If you're tuning into the ASA Awards in November, Flynn and I will be doing a bit of a presentation, the speechy thing up there. So look forward to that. Thanks for listening. Just a reminder that the Cyber Minutes podcast is for educational purposes only. The views expressed by hosts and guests are their own, not necessarily their employers. Advice discussed is general advice. We promote ethical discussions, not illegal activities. Have a cybersecurity question? Send an email to cyberminutespodcast@gmail.com, as we'd love to answer it. Stay cyber safe.